there and. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome everybody on YouTube. It is another Water, Wetlands and Watersheds seminar. And this week we are very fortunate to have Dr. Mark Brenner with us, maybe for the first time since pre-COVID. It was pre-COVID when you were here with us last time. So Mark Brenner is a paleolimnologist with special interest in tropical and subtropical lakes and watersheds. He's a professor here at UF in the Department of Geological Sciences and director of UF's
Land Use and Environmental Change Institute.
Okay, Land Use and Environmental Change Institute. He has taught or teaches courses in limnology, paleolimnology, lake management, tropical field ecology, and he's done work mostly in Central and South America over the course of his career, as well as across Florida. And he coordinated the Geological Sciences Seminar from 2015 to 2022. As we'll see, I think we'll get like a little bit of a taste of a variety of projects today, but he's worked in Mexico, Guatemala, Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, the Galapagos, Colombia, and the list goes on and on. China, Cambodia, Madagascar. And he spent 15 years as the co-editor-in-chief at the Journal of Paleolimnology until 2022. So, Dr. Brenner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Let's go on here.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks everybody for coming out today. Great to see some faces I haven't seen in quite a while. So what I want to do today is do a little bit of a history of the work that's been done in the Maya Lowlands. I'll also take you up into the highlands briefly toward the end of the presentation. Some of the material I'm going to show today, some of you are probably familiar with, you've seen before, but also I'll bring you up to date on some of the things that we're doing right now, and also ask if you have some insights or recommendations about how we should proceed going forward. So just to get everybody oriented here, down the left-hand corner here, you see the Yucatan Peninsula jutting up into the Gulf of Mexico, right? And so, right, maybe a little school here. But this is basically a very large limestone block, and the northern part of the Yucatan is very low lying. Down in the southern part, in the Peten of northern Guatemala, you have exposed Cretaceous limestones in that point. And then down here, of course, you have the highlands, volcanic highlands. So people have split this in many ways, the northern lowlands, the southern lowlands, and then the highlands to the south. And you can see this if you look at a topo map like this, with this area sort of encompassing the lowlands, a little bit of intrusive granites here in southern Belize, but again, this northern lowland area about 100 to 300 meters above sea level there. And what we'll talk about today is what Adibi described as coaxing history to conduct experiments. And the idea there is that nature over time, either through volcanic eruptions, climate changes, fires, tsunamis, or human agency, metal smelting or land clearance, there have been these sort of natural experiments, and it really is now up to us to go to natural archives, whether it be ice cores, lake cores, marine cores, speleothems, to sort of tease out the results of that experiment. So what we're going to do is we'll start down in the Peten of northern Guatemala, where this lovely lake district, whoops, there we go. Okay, and it extends from the west, Lake Peten-Itza, to the Twin Lakes, Yasha and South Nab in the east. One of the very first lakes that was examined was Lake Peten-Itza here back in the early 1960s. And most recently, we've been working in the Big Lake here, a crypto depression, about 100 square kilometer system that's about 165 kilometers deep. I'll show you some data from this lake, also from Lake South Peten. There are evaporite deposits, basically calcium sulfate deposits in some of these areas. So this is a magnesium sulfate lake, this is a calcium sulfate lake, and this is kind of a calcium carbonate, slightly magnesium sulfate lake also. So just to give you some sense of the grandeur of the peoples who lived in this area in the past, the ancient Maya, there are sites spread throughout the entire region. And of course, as LiDAR has come into regular use now, people are still discovering sites, buried particularly in the southern region where the stature of the vegetation is much higher. And you can look through that vegetation. So this is a site called Sidi Chaltun, which goes back to the middle pre-classic, about almost 800, 900 BCE, and then comes up to the late classic, about 800 to 900 AD. Just to show you a few of these sites, Labna, beautiful structure. This is Palenque, which lies a little bit to the west of the area that we're going to be focused on in Chiapas, and it sits really against true rainforest. So there's a little over 3 meters of rainfall in that area. In most of the peninsula up north, you have very low rainfall, 500 to 600 millimeters per year. And then as you get down to the Peten in northern Guatemala, 1.5 meters to 1.7 meters, something like that of rainfall per year. And soil development and vegetation stature sort of track that distribution. Uxmal, lovely site. So what I'm showing you in many cases are like few buildings or a major building from the site, but these were large civic ceremonial centers with many residential, places outside the main center. And the archaeologists often estimate populations in the late classic, and I'll show you the sort of time frame for that. Estimate 40,000 to 60,000 people in these cities, which conveniently is kind of like the University of Florida and its student population and staff and faculty on any given day. But these are really spectacular tourist sites and also archaeological areas. So stratigraphically, what this looks like is basically about 1500 BCE. There's evidence for people settling in these areas. More, there were hunter-gatherers there, certainly long before. There are cave sites that go back to the late Pleistocene. But about this time, maybe 3,000 years ago, it's a little bit more, people are starting to settle more sedentarily and do agriculture. By 800 or 900 BCE, you're starting to see construction of sort of civic ceremonial centers. And as you go through time, some sites ascend in terms of their importance and others kind of fade. These are like little city states. And as you also go through time, it becomes evident that these people have developed a real deep knowledge of astronomy, calendars, passage of time, numerical system, of the decimal numerical system, a glyphic system of writing. They begin to erect what are called stele carved limestone pillars that actually commemorate the installation of new leaders and so forth. And then by the time you get to the late classic, about 600 and 900 CE, you see this very flourishing civilization throughout the region. Many sites. Some people have estimated, again now with LIDAR, that there may have been in just the southern lowlands alone as many as 3 to 11 million. It's a very broad range of estimate, but certainly far denser than anything you see today, which is kind of somewhat unique in the world because most places there are many more people today than there were in the past. Then something happens in the 9th century AD. Some people have referred to it as the collapse. That's sort of politically passé now, but certainly a restructuring. Thereafter, you see some sort of reestablishment to the northern part of the Yucatan with sites like Chichen Itza and Tulum. But for the most part, you don't see the grandeur that you saw before. There's no more dedication of stele. The dated stele sort of terminate. You see the kind of ceramics, instead of being these beautiful polychromes, they get kind of rough looking. Many of the settlements are sort of small and walled, very defensive. And that goes on for a while. And of course, then the Spanish arrive and the conquest occurs. But again, a huge demographic decline at that point. But I don't want to forget to say that the Maya are still there in large numbers. There are about, in the northern part of the peninsula, maybe 700,000 Yucatec speakers today. So the culture is alive and well. But to go back and start at the beginning in terms of research, paleo research in this area, it probably starts really with people like Ursula Kogel and G. Evelyn Hutchinson. Ursula was a geochemist, interested a lot in the chemistry of soils and so forth, but also got involved in archaeology itself. She was married briefly in the 50s to George Cogill. And one of the things that Ursula pursued was thinking about the collapse, whether it may have had to do with skewed sex ratios. She was interested in looking at in modern populations, and she found in Guatemala that although at birth the ratio was close to 1-to-1, as you might expect, in adulthood there were way more males than females, and she found that women breastfed the boys much longer than the girls, and she figured the skewed sex ratio could ultimately contribute to the demise of a culture. And of course, we do see this in some modern cultures today where there's favoritism towards male children. Hutchinson probably needs no introduction. People who have taken limnology know him from the treatises, and it's probably arguable that he was responsible for many of the great ecologists of the 20th century. And one of the things I just wanted to point out here, if you've not looked at this limnology and oceanography issue from 71, this tree, again, this is now going back over 50 years. There are a couple of branches on this tree that I think are worth noting. One is the Deavy branch over here, and Deavy was my major professor here at UF, and I chose these branches in part because these two people, H.T. Odom and Deavy, were here at UF. Probably see some people here you recognize out there who were leaves at that time on the branches, and of course now merit much thicker branches of their own. So what you can do is you can go look that up. Actually, if you just Google the Hutchinson tree, you'll get it, and then you can sort of clip a branch as I did here, and you can start adding in people that where you think they belong. Excuse me if I got anything wrong with but one of the first sort of pubs that came out of this was a 66 pub in the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and you can see Ursula and Gogol and Hutchinson here from Yale, along with Clyde Goulden, who was working on the zooplankton microfossils, Redcheck, who was working on sponge spicule, Ruth Patrick, who was famous diatomist. Ruth died, I think, in 2015. She was just short of 106 years old. And so I always said that, being a diatomist is probably good for your longevity. And Matsuo Tsukada was working on the pollen at that point, again, working on a small lake there. Really shortly after that, Alan Kovich, who many people probably know through his work with freshwater invertebrates, big freshwater invertebrates of North America book, and also Minzy Stoiber. So Alan is now retired from University of Georgia at the other Odom Center in Georgia, and I stay in touch with Alan periodically. Minzy had an interesting history. He was Dutch, came to the States, went back to Holland, and came back here. One of the stories about him was apparently he had a little milk route in the early 40s, and apparently when the Nazis came around to round people up, he was out delivering milk, so he was spared. And he was at Yale when radiocarbon dating was sort of in development. Liddy developed the method in 1950, roughly, and then went to University of Washington to the Perm Center. But anyway, they were some of the first people in the late 60s, 70s to be working in the region. There's this paper on Lake Peten, looking at changes in molluscan diversity. And then we start to see some of the first work with OAT and stable isotope work. And again, this was done in Lake Chichen Canal, the lake that we go back to much later, but basically on the shoulders of those giants. So Ed Deavy came to UF in 71. He had done 3 years at Dalhousie University in Canada. And when he came here, he was working with a multidisciplinary group, Prue Rice in anthropology, and Don Rice, who was working with Jack quite a bit at that time. Both of them archaeologists, but thinking about the environmental impacts of humans on the environment. And I sort of put this red arrow here to say, to indicate that at the time, in the 70s. This was really sort of the major focus, looking at this long-term experiment in the use of tropical forest and the tropical environment and how it impacted things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show you a few examples that I think illustrate the kind of major findings in terms of how people affected this environment. So this comes from Lake Peten, and this is really the pollen work of Barbara Leiden, who was a postdoc with DV, but was based at USF. She was situated there in large part because her husband had a faculty position down there. So on the left side here, we're looking back, depth in the profile in terms of meters. Over on the right side here, we have some selected radiocarbon dates. There's a 13-meter core that goes back. Here's a date of 7235 BC, about 9,000 years ago or so. And on the x-axis here, this is percent of pollen sum. So basically, at each level in the core, Barbara takes a sample, counts pollen grains, maybe 300 grains, and then represents each of these taxa as a percent of that total pollen sum. So where you see thick black lines like this, means those are really dominant. You know, here's Rosamum or Limon making up 50% of that total sum. So the idea here was that, and this is repeated over and over again in many of the lakes of the area, if you start about here, which is about the beginning of the Holocene, after we come out of the last ice age, we see that we have a lot of tropical forests here, right? All this area here these are tropical forest taxa. And then as we come up to this red line here, about 7,000 years later, all of a sudden those decline and we start to see things like pines and oaks, cecropia, second growth tree, grasses, poaceae, starting to pick up spotty presence of zea or maize, corn, pollen, a lot of weedy kinds of things in here. And then about 1,000 years ago or so, suddenly the forest seems to come back and these other things largely drop out or diminish to some degree. So the way that was interpreted is that basically at the beginning of the Holocene, we see this rapid forest expansion. Now we have longer cores where we can demonstrate that very clearly. For about a 2,000-year period, there was very severe deforestation, and then the forest bounds back. And this kind of correlates nicely with what the archaeologists tell us about population densities in the region over time. And subsequently, we went back to the same lake and we were able to essentially look into the sediments remotely using seismic imaging. So again, this is that same lake, South Peten, the old core that I just showed you was from there. Here's a transect from south to north like this. And we can see this bottom S6 here is this organic sediment that accumulated over maybe 6,000 or 7,000 years, 1.5 meters of it. It's very high in organic carbon here, TOC. So about probably 40 to 50% organic matter. And then above that, we have a lot of clay material that we interpret as an erosional deposit. It occurs over about 2,000 years, very rapidly. And then at the top, again, we get organic rich sediments as the soils are stabilized and the forest comes back. And this is, again, a sort of pattern that is seen over and over again. And this, in a recent paper where sort of recapitulated some of this early work, this is what we sort of envision. You know, the watershed looks something like this from 11,000 to 3,000 with a lot of forest, organic sediment accumulating. Then for about a 2,000-year period, we take down that forest. There's a lot of erosion, particularly in the steep terrain of Peten, and a lot of clay, which all the Maya clay accumulates. And then atop that is this post-Maya organic material with high forest. And by the 1960s, in that whole northern sector of Guatemala, population density was super low. There were like 35,000 people throughout the entire northern third of Guatemala. One of the things that was going on sort of at the same time and in the background was Dee was very preoccupied with the idea of getting ancient sediments from the area. Of course, 1969, the year I graduated from high school, we landed people on the moon. Still had no clue what the ice age environment in the lowland tropics looked like. And again, these are two of Barbara's publications. The first one in PNAS in 1984, based on these cores that actually penetrated. We had tried a number of times using gravity cores, ultimately had to get a company to drill for us. And down here, I think you can see really clearly this sort of break. So here's sort of the Pleistocene Holocene boundary in red. Here's tropical trees, and you see below that line, there's sort of very spotty presence, whereas you do see pollen of temperate taxa, things like pine and oak, herbaceous taxa, and so forth. Then all of a sudden, this tropical assemblage comes in, and what you're seeing above that, of course, is people taking it out. So here at a different lake, at Lake Shield, not at Lake Salpetin, the deforestation and then reforestation at the top. So that was sort of the first glimpse into deep time. So again, Kovich and Stoiber had published this article in '74, which was what led us back to Lake Chichancana. We went back there in '92 and then again in '93 to get cores. And one of the things about this lake is it sits in a region of the peninsula where there is quite an abundance of evaporites. So a lot of calcium sulfate in the rock there. And consequently, this lake is at saturation today for calcium sulfate or gypsum, and it has this tendency to go up and down. So this is a little sort of park area. This is just from last month. Some colleagues sent me this picture. We know that they didn't build that there, in the water, but the lake goes up and down, and when it goes way down, it tends to accumulate gypsum on the bottom. So we use that as a signal for looking at drought episodes in the past. The other thing we can do is we can use the stable isotopes. And as I mentioned, Stoiber and Kovich and Stoiber had done work like that, but in the late 60s, when they did a lot of their measurements, early 70s, when mass spectrometry wasn't quite up to what it is today. So I think their samples were spaced about 500 years apart. And in this study, we were able to do that at about 20-year resolution, something like that. So the idea here is something like this. So here's age in radiocarbon years. Back here, you can add about 1,000 years to get to calendar ages. Over here is depth in the sediment. And then across here, you have calcium carbonate content, sulfur content, which is really gypsum. And you can see these gypsum bands. And these are the delta O18 of ostracods and the delta O18 of terrestrial gastropods. And the way this system works is that as the lake evaporates, there are these two stable isotopes of oxygen, 16 and 18, 16 being by far the predominant one. But as you get intense evaporation, the H2O 16 is preferentially evaporated from the lake, concentrating more H2O 18. So essentially, when the delta O18 goes to the right, it means there are drier conditions. And when it's further to the left, there are wetter conditions. And so we poured through the entire lake bed here. And just an aside here, the age down here at about 76, 7,400 radiocarbon years, and maybe 8,600 calendar years, almost identical to what you see at Noonan's Lake or Lake Lochloosa. All these systems seem to have responded probably to climate wetting, but also maybe to sea level rise too, that's sort of forcing the aquifer up in these areas. At the onset of filling, we see a lot of gypsum being deposited. We see very positive values for delta O18, relatively positive, and we see the presence of this foraminiferin, many of Beckeri, that likes really saline conditions. It drops out, and things get much wetter in a very short amount of time, and then we kind of go through about 3,000 or 4,000 years of just sort of ticking away until we get to about 3,000 years ago, which is coincident when people start to settle here, and we start to see drying again. And we sort of see these maximum values at about 1,000, a little over 1,000 years ago, which is coincident with the timing of the so-called Maya collapse. And then it gets wet, gets a little bit wetter right thereafter. So we had suggested in an article, which actually came out almost exactly 30 years ago, it'll be 30 years in June, that there may have been a connection between these dramatic droughts and the Maya collapse. Right, so again, this climate change, these high delta O18 values and gypsum concentrations indicate these intense droughts. And subsequently, there's been some modeling done using other isotopes too, which suggest rainfall reductions of maybe 41 to 54% over the sort of normal, with some severe periods of 70% reduction. And you can imagine what that consequences might have been for agriculture. We're also seeing evidence, and I'll get to this at the very end, from speleothems or stalagmites for these dramatic droughts, right? So it is our, suggestion again, and this has been repeated in numerous areas around the peninsula, that drought could have played a role. So again, in the late 90s, there was a project that began called the International Continental Scientific Drilling Program. It's ICDP, S part of it is not included. And Dave Hodel, who was here in geology, was a paleoceanographer who was very familiar with a lot of the sort of techniques, and jumped on this and said, we really ought to get with the program on this. And as it turned out, we were sort of the sixth of the major projects, lake drilling projects, to take place. So leading up to drilling, we had to do a number of things. We did some coring, some preliminary coring with gravity cores, did seismic imaging. This is all to kind of, justify that there's a record there. We held a workshop in 2003. We had to get a lot of permits from many agencies in Guatemala. And of course, many of you who work internationally know what is involved in that. We did a lot of politicking, involved some fun stories, and we did a lot of outreach and interviews and things like that. We created these trifolds to distribute locally in Peten and let people know what we were planning to do. There was a lot of sort of concern that we were going to be drilling for oil in that area and contaminate this beautiful lake. One of the things we also did is we printed these bathymetric maps of the lake that we were able to develop after our seismic imaging work. This is the only lake I've ever worked on that turned out to be much, much deeper than local people thought. The locals thought it was about 60 meters deep, and there's a 160-meter contour right there. We printed these on plastic, made poster-sized ones, gave them to restaurants and so forth throughout the area. So here we are, Kuhlenberg coring. There's Dave Hodel, maybe laying up some of those cores. And when you do the seismic imaging, the beauty of that is you go back and forth, back and forth. In fact, the black lines here are the sort of lines that we did. The blue line here is showing you south to south on the left side to north. And this is the stratigraphy. So because you're linked to a GPS, now you can sort of pick and choose where you want to do your drilling, right? Here's a line, a blue line across the lake, and you can pick your drill sites that way. This was the workshop that we held in 2003. Then we applied for money and got the money to do this sort of drilling. We ended up ultimately collecting a total of 1,327 meters at 7 drill sites with, as you can see, multiple holes at each of the sites. So what they do is they basically take 3-meter sections at a time. And then once you're done with a hole, you move over about 10 meters and you offset by 1.5 meters. So you do overlaps, and then you can even move over one more time and sort of fill in and make sure that you have all of the record. So our first sort of approach here was to look at this one site, PI6, and this is just an age and depth relationship for it. Strangely, very sort of linear sedimentation rate. They're going back about 40,000 years. And this is just the sort of lithology of those sediments over time. This goes back about 70,000 years beyond, so beyond radiocarbon, but a few highlights of what was discovered here. So this is an isotope record done by my student Jaime Escobar for his PhD. And here on this is the delta O18 on a mix of different organisms here. So here's an ostracod, or thing called limnocytherae. And then where it falls out, we did on pseudocandona, and then a snail here, and then another ostracot at the top. But going back to about 43,000 years ago, you can see all these values sit in the fairly positive or cool, dry sort of sector here with some dips, the very low values in the deglacial. And then as we come out of the deglacial and into the Holocene, there's this huge rise. And there's a little rule of thumb that for each per mil along here that you go down, right, that would be about a 4-degree warming. So if you were to go from here to here, that might represent 28 degrees of warming, which would be, kind of ridiculous. That would mean it was freezing down here at that time. And subsequently using a dual isotope method, looking back at samples from here and carbonates and hydration water and gypsum, we were able to determine that actually you can reconstruct temperature, and it was about 6 to 10 degrees cooler back then. So much of what you see here is wetting as opposed to warming, but both were occurring. This is a very, very long record that a student from Yunnan created, and sort of interesting thing here, again, the Holocene, the recent is up here, and you can see sort of organization of the tropical forest here. There's Moaceae, ficus, these forest types, Procyon, deforestation, and at the very top, again, reforestation. But what is very cool about this is you look back into much deeper time, you don't see the presence of that forest for long stretches. So here we do this even from that 1-4 where you just see the very spottiest presence of high forest pollen types. If you go back to the last interglacial here at about 125,000 years ago, it doesn't look like the modern. And of course, people often look to that as sort of a modern analog for today. Sea level was a little bit higher than today, and we have people in our department looking at trying to get the exact magnitude of that. But in any case, there are certainly sort of non-analog situations going back in time in terms of the pollen, and nothing looks like the very recent. So again, in the late Pleistocene, these tropical forest taxa were very sparse. There is no real modern analog going back 225,000 years ago. The last interglacial looked very different from what it is today. And of course, these vegetation shifts, not only in the Pleistocene, but coming up into the Holocene, are driven by this combination of changes in temperature and precipitation. So now I'm going to briefly take you up to the highlands in Guatemala to Lake Amatitlan. Amatitlan sits here. You can see a number of active volcanoes around it. And it has a river that comes into it about right there. And then the water runs out and down towards the Pacific here. This is sort of trapped area down here. There's a narrow little part there with a train trestle across it. We've cored that lake on a number of occasions in 2000, 2012, and again in 2019. We went there in 2018, but our gear never got out of customs, so we had to go back again in 2019, just fine. One of the things that we found in some of the cores we got 2012 is we could actually look at tephra, these basically in a 3,000-year core. We could look at these various tephras and sort of look at the periodicity of explosivity in that area, and you can see it not only in the tephras themselves, but you can kind of pick it out in magnetic susceptibility and density in the density record. So you see a cluster of them down here, and you see the high densities and magnetic susceptibilities. The other thing about this lake is it, drains this area through the city. There's all kinds of crap that comes down that river. They put nets across the mouth of the river and they catch all the solids that I'm talking like dead goats and plastic bottles and things. They clear those out daily. but of course, a lot of the nutrient gets through and you get these massive microcystis blooms, which are pretty impressive. So Matt Waters, who's at Auburn, does a lot of work on pigments in sediments, and he was really interested in looking at the Amatitlán record. We went there, we got a little over a 2,000-year record the last time we were there. And what you see is the date over here on the left side. Here's concentrations of these various things in nanomoles per gram organic matter. And what you're looking at, here's the direct measure of cyanotoxin. Okay, so basically, the story here is it's sort of present throughout the record. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not a 20th century thing, as a lot of eutrophication is around the world. If you look at these cyanobacterial biomarkers here, canthaxanthin, aphanizophil, and echinine, they're present too. I think echinine wasn't actually measured in the uppermost part of the record, but the take home was that this is not something super new, although at the very top here, and I don't think this is simply diagenetic, these are off the charts. So certainly the situation has gotten much worse, but clearly if people were inhabiting this basin in the past, they probably were having to contend with these kinds of things. Obviously these cyanotoxins affect your liver. In many cases, there are other ones that produce neurotoxins. And the sort of scary thing is that a lot of the breakdown products, if they're used, that water is used as irrigation, water can actually get into plants, crop plants, and affect people. I never eat fish when I'm visiting that area, even if they tell me they're farmed elsewhere. I don't know. So again, this area has repeatedly received these inputs of ash, and in fact, because it was 2010 or 11, there was a pretty good explosion there, and we went to core in 2012 and collected a lot of ash samples that had just been piled up there, and you see it very clearly if you do dredge samples. One of the best things, I might have mentioned this even last time I was here, was we were dredging in 2018 because we didn't have our pouring gear, and I dredged a diaper. It's the first time I ever dredged a diaper. So most recently in 2023, we went back to the northern part of the peninsula with Matt Waters with an Auburn crew. We went back to two lakes that we already knew pretty well, and we picked two sort of new lakes. Again, with the idea of focusing on paleopigments here. So here's two of the sort of small new lakes that we looked at. We were doing a lot on Google Earth. And one of the reasons this guy who's down here, probably everybody recognizes the Mad Hatter, right? And the reason, of course, that the Mad Hatter was mad was because they used to put mercury in the hat bands there, and these guys were exposed to a little bit too much mercury. Well, it turns out that we have immense amounts of mercury in the core from this little lake. And these two lakes are not far apart, but we don't see it in the other lake, which is kind of interesting. So there's Matt and two of his students getting ready to go out to the center of this lake. Here's our coring rods down here in the right. Here we are at Coba doing the same thing. And at the end of the day, at Coba, we love to do this sort of thing. We take these cores in meter increments. And again, we offset them by a half meter. So take the uppermost stuff, we sample that in the field. Then we do these longer cores and we lay them out and kind of match up the stratigraphies. And yeah, we got it all. And if we're not satisfied with that, when we split the cores and we take images, so these are meter long ones with the breaks here, but this is like the offset of the next half meter, the core taken a few meters away. And, I think you'll find it satisfactory that we sort of match the stratigraphy of those. And even then, if you're not really fully convinced, when we run these on a core logger, what's called the core logger, we can send a cesium beam through the middle of the core to measure density. And so here's a core, the blue, going back in time, and then the red, the overlap that we take just over a little bit. And, I hope you'll see that those kind of match. And obviously, in this lake, we saw those banding patterns, so it's not gonna be an absolutely perfect match. But the overall is pretty good. And we did the same at a second site, many tens of meters or hundreds of meters away. And if you kind of squint at that, you can see the same pattern, you know, top and bottom. So two different sites in the lake, which means things are kind of repeatable. So there we are taking cores at Chichen Canal. This is the mud-water interface ore from that lake. You can see the kind of green algal material uncompressed, and then you see this kind of banding with some gypsum here. This is the lake that precipitates gypsum. And then right down here, there's this very thick gypsum layer, which is probably coincident with the so-called Maya collapse. And at Chichen Canal, one of the things that was kind of fun is the last drive we did here, 2023, exactly 30 years after we collected our first core there, the basal sediment, this is very clayey material here, overlain by some organic material right here. And there's this a bunch of burned grass that we were able to date. Above that, some gypsum, and then we go into carbon, exactly the same stratigraphy that we collected 30 years ago. So lastly, one of the things that we're doing with colleagues in the UK and Cambridge, Dave Hodel is over there, and we started this actually back in 2005, and then Dave left in 2007. It's kind of ramping up once again, but we're working in some of the caves of the area with speleothems or stalagmites, which also preserve a record of past rainfall very nicely. In 2022, they asked me if I would go back in the cave to check on what's called the SIP, which I'll show you in a minute. It's this in a moment. It's a sampler that's sampling the drip waters on a regular basis. That's when I sort of decided I'm reaching that age when I don't want to be crawling on my belly through these incredibly tight spaces and on slippery rocks and things, but it is a pretty spectacular site. So as you go back into the cave, there's a series of these so-called underground cenotes or water-filled sinks. And then at the very end, there's a place where they had actually drilled and opened an area and put in a well. But this is what is called a SIP, and it's basically a battery-driven circular thing like this with a bunch of tubes in it. And every week it moves and allows the tube to fill. And what we can then do is through the year, we can look at the isotopic signature of the rainfall and how it changes through the seasons. And there's actually a very pronounced seasonal difference. So in the dry season, the values of the delta 18 values are much higher. In the wet season, particularly in September, when you have tropical storms and so forth, they're much lower. But a lot of what we're trying to do is sort of get the modern sort of situation, look at the carbonate that's precipitated under these various conditions, and then be better able to interpret the past. So this is Dan James, former student, recently defended his PhD at Cambridge, working with the SIP. And then Nancy Yolamar, who was a grad student who I co-directed at UNAM, who worked on something completely different. She was working on gastropods in the coastal lagoons, the sort of stratigraphy of those that really wanted to check out the caves. And in any case, these are the kinds of data that you can generate. So this is some of Dan's work that is really in final form and just needs to be submitted. But over on the left side there, you see the delta 18 values of the carbonate in the speleothem. So here's the speleothem cut lengthwise and drilled at very, very high resolution. So values up like that are wet times, values down are dry times. And basically these pink periods are dry periods. And the numbers that you see in here are the numbers of consecutive years of dry conditions. And up here, you see the age of that speleothem, or the date, really, 880 to about 1020, and then we get into a hiatus here. But what's really fascinating about this is you can actually get samples within years too, right? You can actually see in some cases within your, I think here's 13-year and 7-year sort of drought episodes. So again, We can't get that kind of resolution in the lake records. We're sort of confined to doing that here. So before I sort of end here, I want to sort of toss out to you folks how you think we ought to proceed with some of this mercury work. To the lakes, Coba and Scotch have incredibly high mercury. It seems to be confined to about 3,000 or 1,000 years ago. There's certainly no mystery about the fact that the Maya were very fascinated by mercury. There's no mercury in the local rock there. It comes from the volcanic terrains. And it's possible, for instance, that people were bringing in cinnabar or mercuric sulfides and then cooking it to extract the liquid mercury. It's also possible that they were just carving it or using it to coat the facades of buildings in the area. It has a beautiful sort of reddish color. But the fact of the matter is you do find in some of the soils around archaeological sites, even in the lowlands, fairly high mercury. And now we can, it's just in the soils, it's a little bit hard to get the timing of that, but now we have this stratigraphically in the record from 2 lakes. And what is pretty clear is that if this were coming in atmospherically, as it does, say, in Florida from incinerators and other sources, we should find it in all the lakes. And, we're only finding it in very high levels in, this one lake, Scotch, and in Coba. And when we first saw it in the Coba core from 2023, we're like, is that for real? Let's do the 2016 core and document that that's real. And it came out exactly the same. We see the same sort of concentration peaks and the same timing also. So, we're going to be following up on that, but if people have ideas about things we should be doing, that certainly would welcome any comments. So with that, I will stop.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions and we'll start in the room and then see if YouTube comes up with anything. So, all right, questions for Dr. Brenner. And we start with students if possible.
I guess a lot of this information is very new to me, a lot of this research, but I guess I'm just trying to derive what the main goal of your lab and your research is in terms of paleo historical atmospheric trends. Is it just to compare it to modern day trends or?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when I came here as a graduate student, this was not, anywhere sort of on the horizon for me. I thought I was going to come here and do population genetics of sea turtles. That was Archie Carr. I applied to zoology here and thought I was going to work with Archie Carr. And then Ed Devey got my application, and I had this conversation with him when I was in Central America. And he explained about this project, and he said to me, of course, you're free to do whatever you want, but I do have this project going on in Guatemala if you're interested. And when I arrived here and I learned more about it, it did become, pretty intriguing. The idea that you could use these, what I call natural archives of information about past climate and environment to see how things had changed through time. And of course, there was, I think, a sort of general assumption that over the Holocene, at least the last 10,000 years, things have not changed that much in terms of climate, right? Maybe in terms of human impact. And I think now, some people would argue the Anthropocene should be, 7,000 years ago or 8,000 years ago with the rise of agriculture and so forth. But what we do, and I do, my colleagues do, we're interested in, different time frames and different sorts of questions. So for a lot of the work we've done here in Florida has been focused really on very recent impacts on the lakes here. So cultural eutrophication over the last 120 years. If you look back at Florida, turn of the last century, 1900, population's about 500,000 in the state, and now we're about 23 million. I think we just surpassed that. So, and there's been an awful lot of pressure on the 8,000 lakes in the state. If you go look at Lake County, Orange County, And you go in on Google Earth as prime real estate, and it's almost all developed. We did a study here with the Water Institute, in which we were looking at sort of the inadvertent but positive impacts of having corridors that were developed on various aquatic systems in the state. So it was the wetlands, the lakes, the rivers, and the coastal environments. And of course, because a lot of these corridors track the river systems, there were certainly real benefits to be had there. When we looked at lakes, it was almost like there was no benefit, because by the time corridors were in place, all these areas had been built out, and residential structures had been put all around many of them. So, you know, there are people in my field who do things like looking at the impact of ancient smelting of metals in the Andes, Roman smelting, you know, deep time. There's now with the ICDP, the possibility of drilling, you know, I mean, not only the possibility, but it has been realized, drilling very deep sections like places like Lake Peten-Itza in Ghana that go back 1 million years, and you know, the Rift Lakes of Africa and so forth, to get these very long-term perspectives on climate change. And some of this, of course, helps you establish that, you know, what we're seeing today in terms of the rapidity of CO2 increase in the atmosphere and warming is outside of, you know, say what happened in the past in terms of how those changes occur. Although in some cases they've been very abrupt. Certainly looks like to me in Guatemala, sort of infusion of tropical forests there, the entry of tropical forests seems to be a very rapid phenomenon. It suggests to me that those things are probably hanging out in little refugia, maybe dry sinkholes during the latest Pleistocene, and then when the, you know, conditions are right, the right moisture and temperature conditions, they just come out and, you know, expand over the landscape at a very rapid clip. But does that kind of get it?
Yeah, that gives more questions.
Yeah.
Well, very nice talk, thank you. So you started off by talking about the work of,
Go, yeah.
suggesting that sex ratios were potentially involved in the decline of the population.
Yeah, that was one of her papers, early papers in this, yeah.
So it's hard for me to believe that that's a real possibility, and your work suggests that it's much more, that's less likely given that there's these climatic changes happening. So I'm just wondering if you want to reflect on that as a possibility for the decline in the population.
Yeah, you mean what she
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like, yeah, you could model something like that through time. I think it would be very disruptive had that been the case. You know, this, she was basing it on some things she was seeing in the modern. I think it would certainly be very disruptive, and you probably in some places can find examples where males have migrated out, have emigrated because of the skewed sex ratios. In some cases, you know, I don't know what the numbers look like for China, but there was certainly a preference for male children there, and apparently, you know, females were aborted at much higher rates than males. I'm not sure if we've seen what the long-term impacts of something like that would be. I don't know what the numbers look like. But there's also been, like, beyond these few ideas, there's been all kinds of proposals for, you know, what accounted, you know, and I think the two areas that we looked at, sort of environmental degradation, soil loss, overuse, population growth, and then this sort of abrupt climate shift. Those are sort of two ideas, but beyond that, people have speculated about disease, whether it be something brought in from the outside, race through the population, even the ideas of insect infestations. There's just a whole, people even talked about earthquakes, but of course this is not an earthquake prone area, so that's, you know, I would take that one off the table. Right, you know, I think I'm safe taking that one.
Just a quick comment on that, the modern day example of that is the Yanomami people who inhabit what is today the boundary zone between Venezuela and Brazil, have a very skewed sex ratio for abundance of male. And there's a tremendous amount of inter warfare that takes place as a result of that, raiding for females, basically,
Wow.
that sort of thing. So
Mhm.
it's not a unprecedented
And,
observation.
right, and a lot of the social scientists, of course, advocate for more social, like
Yeah,
interstate, if you will, sort of. But, my argument would be, if you have something like, the skewed sex ratio, if you're limited in your resources, then you probably will have those kinds of the warfare and the taking of captives and things like that, which it's pictured in a lot of the Maya, iconography. There was certainly plenty of warfare at that time, and then at the collapse, there was lots of examples of sites with people who were brutally murdered and so forth. So, but I think those could be connected with these environmental climatic facilities too.
Well, you know who just chimed in from YouTube? You might recognize Dr. Peter Frederick
Okay.
on
Hi,
YouTube.
Peter.
Yeah, so he says nice, and if you have to go to your next class, totally understand, but we'll keep Dr. Bear here for a moment. So nice talk, Mark. I was wondering if there are any signature of mercury in the bones or teeth of people or food animals living in areas of mercury contamination.
Yeah, I think that's a place to go. There's a sort of review paper, I think Tim Beach he's at UT Austin, where they were looking at sites where there is mercury, but I don't know how people have gotten into looking at it in the, in the human
Paleo record.
paleo record and the burial records. But there is there's a fairly substantial record. It's a little bit more difficult these days to work with human remains. It's almost impossible in the US. It's actually a little bit easier in places like Guatemala and Mexico, and we've done a little bit of, with human teeth, not for mercury, but for other isotope work. But yeah, I don't know of studies that have looked at either the animal or human, other animals.
Was mercury involved in gold processing at that point, or is that a more?
Well, I mean, not
recent
in that,
phenomenon?
that would have been not in that area, maybe, obviously today it's widespread, and maybe down through Colombia, in the gold mining areas. But certainly there was lots of widespread trade. So you find, obsidian blades, throughout the Maya Lowlands and a lot of these elite burials. You find jades. They're all, coming from the highlands. So it wouldn't surprise me if people were bringing things like cinnabar and even liquid mercury into the lowland region. And it does show up, in a sort of, I want to say more diffuse way. It shows up in soils and so forth. I think it's nice that we have it in this now stratigraphic column that gives us a little bit better idea of the exact timing or when it's important there. And the cinnabar itself is, it has this sort of reddish color to it that I think was probably, something that was particularly attractive, and probably the use of maybe burials or perhaps with building facades, which would, account for very large amounts coming. Yeah, Jack.
A question about the pollen record and the spikes in Brosimum. Could some of them have been Brosimum plantations?
Yeah, so, Denny Puliston had, ideas about Brosimum being a sort of a food that they used during tough times, and that some of these underground storage areas were used for storing Brosimum nuts. I think rather than plantations, I might think selective leaving of those plants, just as you see that with some of the really tall trees where people are doing either agriculture or have cattle today, like ceiba. I mean, ceiba is still a sacred tree. So many of the places you drive to, you see these very large ceibas either in the center of town or out in people's fields. Yeah, I think it's certainly plausible, and other people who I don't fully necessarily agree with have talked about, the fact that the whole area was converted to kitchen gardens. And as far as the eye could see, and they were still have very high diversity of plants in those kitchen gardens. And today you can go to places like Izamal. It always kind of blows my mind. And if you go up on the old structure, the ancient Maya structure there, and look out over the town actually looks greener and higher stature vegetation than the areas out on the periphery. And it is because people have their kitchen gardens in many cases. They're pretty diverse. So, there's certainly a modern example of that happening. And there have been a lot of studies, and as you well know, on those kitchen gardens and the diversity that exists there. And one of the things about the modern Mayas, they've managed to incorporate all the European plants. They came just like that, and they have their Maya names for them, and they have their uses for them, both as food and medicinal uses. So it gets hard after a while to remember which are the natives and which are the, one of my favorites, of course, is the climbing cactus, right? We call it the fruit, dragon fruit, which is a native there, and then go over and I see it in Cambodia. It's like being grown regularly in Cambodia. It's hugely common in Yucatan. And actually the way they often grow it there is they plant bursera trees, and then they just cut them off at about 6 feet high and let the cactus climb up into the bursera. And when the plant flowers, they cut a liter bottle of Pepsi or Coke or whatever, and they wrap it around so that the birds don't get to the fruit, and then they harvest them when they're mature. They take the bottle off.
Let's give Dr. Brenner one more round of applause. So next week, we're actually going to stay with lakes, but we'll be closer to home. So we have Dr. Osama Taribi from USF. He's actually going to come up and tell us about optimizing reservoir, basically how to make Lake Okeechobee less of a challenging detriment to the estuaries on the east and west coast. So optimizing lake discharges to reduce phytoplankton loads. All right, we'll see you all next week. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone on YouTube. See you next time.